We're back from lunch, and as you guys can see, I'm not Jason Smith. Bless his heart, he's probably wishing he was here instead of what he's doing. So he got tied up with everything over at the hospital, and I'm sure would really like being here to talk with you guys. But we're going to, so tomorrow, Dr. Ritala is going to talk in detail about the environment and the role of the environment in infections and those sorts of things. But what Jason was going to talk about today was a little bit more about the practical side of what they do in environmental services. So we're going to try to touch on that, and I'll probably touch on a couple of issues that he may not have touched on from an infection prevention standpoint, but hopefully I'll make sure I cover what he does want to. And for some reason, my screen's not advancing. We'll give it a minute and see if it's. Yeah, I can't advance my slides, Amy. Amy, are you there? Whoops. Yeah, I can't hear you. I don't know what's going on. I don't know if you can hear me. Sorry, guys. I don't know if you can hear me. Okay, so Elizabeth can hear me. Okay, all right. So now maybe we're good now. Maybe I'm just impatient. So anyway, as I mentioned, Dr. Ritala is going to go into detail about this tomorrow, but I think it is important for us as infection preventionists to know that the environment certainly does play a role in the spread of infection. And we know we have lots of evidence that in particular organisms like MRSA and VRE and C. difficile play a role, and that at any time surfaces may be contaminated. At about 25% of the time, they're contaminated with some sort of epidemiologically important pathogen. Those organisms have the ability to survive anywhere from days to weeks to months, depending on the organism. We also know that the environment, when contaminated, can then contaminate healthcare workers' hands when those surfaces are touched. And that if we disinfect those surfaces, we can interrupt that mode of transmission of infection. So we certainly can appreciate the role of the environment now more than maybe we have in the past. And so what is environmental services role in all of that? Well, certainly their role is to help reduce the spread of infection by properly and thoroughly cleaning and disinfecting the physical environment. I worked with one housekeeping group at one point in time, and I just, on my rounds one day, I walked up and asked the housekeeper on the floor, can you tell me what you do? And he looked at me and he said, I help save lives. And I thought that was pretty powerful. He clearly worked in a facility and in a department that had reinforced the value of what he does. So I always like to tell that story because it kind of makes me feel good that he felt that way about his job, because indeed they do. They help us all save lives. But in your facility, there should be a single individual that has oversight of the environmental services department. Oftentimes, even large hospitals now contract their EVS service out to large contracting companies. Typically, they will have someone in a leadership role that is employed by the hospital as well. There should be a written curriculum for training, whether they follow the 7-step process of room cleaning or whatever their standardized process is. There should be a written curriculum for that. They should have, these are some things that you might want to talk with your EBS director about. How do they demonstrate competencies? Do they do that through return demonstration? Walk them through cleaning a room and then actually observe them doing that? How often are they provided with infection control education? Is that just at time of hire and annually, or if you see an increase in multi-drug resistant organisms, do you do kind of on-the-spot education and training? The other thing, just remember about environmental services, if you do contract those services out, make sure that the contractor provides the same type of OC Health policies and procedures that your facility does. For instance, if you require the flu vaccine be taken, that's something that the contracting agency supports as well, so that those occupational health policies are consistent between the contractor and the facility. And then your policies and procedures should certainly spell out and define what the frequency of cleaning is based on the location and the site. And then also, as we've already mentioned, define what their responsibilities are related to construction activities within the facility. So inpatient daily cleaning. So as you know, primarily EVS Services has a lot of responsibilities. They clean common areas, they clean patient rooms, both on a daily basis and then terminal clean. So we're going to talk a little bit about the daily cleaning first. They do start from the clean to dirty. So they go to the patient area before moving to the restroom. Start with from a top-down approach, very much like what we saw yesterday in the pharmacy, where they clean the less contaminated surfaces and move down to the ones that may be more contaminated. If the patient is in the room for the daily cleaning, they try, as Jason added here, to ask permission to enter their personal space, because even though that's their job to clean the room, that still really is the patient's personal space. And it may be that they say, no, we'd like for you to come back a little bit later, and sometimes that can be accommodated. So that's what they try to do. They try to respect the patient's personal space and recognize that that is their room, especially if they're doing anything along the bed rail in particular, because that really does kind of get up close and personal to the patient. And then high-touch surfaces or areas, and you're going to hear Dr. Atala speak about that. We have used that term that we need to focus cleaning high-touch surfaces, but really we now know that that's hard to define, because just about every surface in the room can be considered to be high-touch. There are certain areas like the doorknob and the overbed table and the call button that get a lot of activity and require special attention, but in general, all of the surfaces in the patient room should be considered to be important, and make sure that we don't miss any of those. One of the ones that gets missed quite often is the light switches, as far as cleaning, because people just don't think about that, as well as faucet handles and some of the toilet flush handles as well. In their mopping, they do that last, obviously, and then they start in the patient room and then move to the bathroom or the restroom. Or depending on the room, they may even use a separate mop, a microfiber mop, in the room versus the one, or in the restroom versus the one that they just used in the room. And Jason mentions a study here looking at that says sanitizing the floors is the best practice since pathogens do move from floor to patient, and not widely believed previously. So there are actually two studies over the last couple of years. One was in AJIC in 16, I think, and the other one was in ITCHE in 17. And AJIC is the American Journal of Infection Control, and ITCHE is Infection Control and Hospital Epidemiology. And that journal is published by SHEA, and AJIC is published by APIC. And in the AJIC journal, they actually discussed the likelihood of things that come in contact with the floor and then have contact with the patient and or the patient's bed being a potential source of transmission and risk. Which kind of makes sense. You know, we shouldn't think of a 5-second rule in healthcare. If something drops on the floor, it's dirty and we shouldn't use it. You know, if nursing personnel drop a pillowcase on the floor, then they should get a clean one and not just pick it up and put it on the pillow. The one thing that, quite honestly, I hadn't thought too much about, and I got a question about it a couple of weeks ago, was about non-skid socks in rehab areas. And I mentioned this yesterday, I think. But in the AJIC article, it actually brings up the risk, or it looked at the contamination of these socks, and then the patient puts their feet in the bed, and now the linens may be contaminated with MRSA or VRE or whatever was on the floor. And you could take that point not only to non-skid socks, but to any other footwear that the patient might have on when they're walking. So the floors are becoming a little bit more of a topic of conversation. And then in the ITCHE article, they actually inoculated a room with some virus on the floor and tried to follow that transfer. And what they found was that it actually got transferred out into the hallway, into the nursing station, into adjacent rooms. So clearly, these organisms can become mobile on healthcare worker, visitor, patient shoes, and those sorts of things. So we don't know what the risk of we know that contamination can occur. That kind of makes sense. If it's something on the floor and it gets put in the bed, then the bed may become contaminated. But what we don't know is, does that then lead to transmission of infection? And we're not sure about that yet. But anyway, it is something to think about, and also something to use in education of why we don't want Foley bags on the floor, linen drops on the floor, we shouldn't use it, and those sorts of things. The other thing about mopping your floors, which you might find interesting at your facility, I did, is that a lot of hospitals don't use disinfectants to clean the floors in all clinical areas. They use a detergent. And oftentimes they use that detergent because it's less damaging to the floor surface. And they'll use something they call a neutral cleaner, which is more of a detergent and not a disinfectant. You know, and the guidelines actually say that you should use a disinfectant on the floor if you're not sure of what kind of soil or body fluid might be present. So I think you can make a case for, in most of our clinical areas, you're really not sure of what might be on that floor, so a disinfectant would be indicated. But that might just be a question you want to go back and ask. What are we using to clean our floors with? So that's kind of inpatient daily cleaning, and then the next major focus that EVS departments do are terminal discharge cleaning, which is just more intensive approach of how that room is cleaned and disinfected. Everything they do in daily cleaning, but they ratchet that up, which might include high dusting the entire room, spot cleaning the walls at terminal cleaning. At time of discharge, there's no need to clean every inch of the wall, but certainly to identify if there's been some sort of splatter on the wall to make sure that's cleaned. Actually moving the furniture in the room to mop and to clean underneath it. One of the things you might want to do when you're making your rounds, if you have recliners in your patient rooms for family members, just lean the recliner back and see what, if anything, is kind of down between the armrest and some of the portions of the chair. You might be a little surprised sometimes that housekeepers forget about pushing the recliner back. And so that's an area that might could use some improvement. Curtains, privacy curtains have always been an issue. And there should be a policy and procedure with how often those are changed. Generally, a lot of facilities will say that privacy curtains need to be taken down and laundered after a patient on isolation is discharged. In addition to that, they should be cleaned clearly if they're visibly soiled. And then on some routine basis, that might be once a quarter, it might be every 6 months. And depending on the area that you're in the emergency department, for instance, you might have a more intense turnover of those privacy curtains versus an area where there might not be as much risk of contamination. There have been a couple of studies, one that, again, Dr. Ratala and colleagues at UNC did and published back in 2014, looking at the use of an improved hydrogen peroxide spray to disinfect curtains either on a daily basis or at time of terminal clean. And then Dr. Donsky from Cleveland also published a study in 2015, and the results were very similar, where they found that it definitely was effective for decontamination of soft surfaces such as privacy curtains without the need to wipe, that just the spraying in and of itself took care of that. It clearly is a more user-friendly option than taking the curtains down. It's less expensive, more efficient, and I would also I think that it's probably more easy to be compliant with, that you may be able to achieve that versus taking the curtains down. So if you haven't looked at that data and need those specific references, I'm happy to provide those for you. So what about the disinfectant? What do you use? Well, the accelerated hydrogen peroxide and the quats are very good disinfectants, and they're effective against most of the pathogens that we see in the hospital or the healthcare setting. A lot of facilities do still use the quats and microfiber mops or microfiber. He's got wipers here. They're the ones that actually stay in the solution, and then they're taken out and put on the little mop and used individually for one room and not used from room to room. But Jason notes that at UNC, they have moved to using the accelerated hydrogen peroxide in the wipe format, the ready-to-use wipes. Some of the rationale for that is on their previous chemical, they had a dwell time or a contact time of 10 minutes. And Dr. Ratala will talk again about contact time in a lot more detail. But on the accelerated hydrogen peroxide, they've been able to achieve a contact time of 1 minute, which clearly is much more efficient. The hazard rating, or we used to call them MDSs, but the sheet rating the hazards of disinfectants for the hydrogen peroxide has a 0 risk for health, 0 for flammability, and also 0 risk for reactivity. There's also no personal protective equipment required, but it is suggested for patient safety when using the accelerated hydrogen peroxide. Since the wipes are ready-to-use wipes, there's really no preparation required. You don't have to worry about special ventilation for mixing chemicals or spills or any of those type things, and you also don't have to worry about testing the concentration after mixture. There are a couple of other comments that I'll add here. When you think about the ideal disinfectants for your facility, you do want to choose something that's broad spectrum, that's fast. The contact time is efficient as it can possibly be. That disinfectant does remain wet, and I think here is a good chance to educate staff and remind them to keep the lids snapped closed on those pop-up tub wipes, because oftentimes you'll go around and see the lids open, so those wipes dry out. So it's really important to keep the lids tight. You want a product that's not toxic and does not produce an odor. There is a product that's a very good product, came on the market a couple of years ago, but has a strong vinegar smell that a lot of the staff and some of the patients complained about. So you want it to be something that does not have an odor. Also, that it's not flammable, and economics have to be considered in all of that too. The only other thing that I'll mention here, just because I thought about it, is that it speaks to the importance of being on your products committee. I don't know if this has happened to you, but it has to me, where I get a call from a department that ordered a piece of equipment. They've already ordered it. It was approved by the products committee. They brought it in, and everybody forgot to look at how the equipment was to be cleaned. And now they realize that the products that the facility uses, our hospital uses, won't work on this particular piece of equipment. So it's really important for you to be involved in the products committee and make sure that cleaning and disinfection is something that's looked at. It may be that you need to get another product, but a lot of times you can save yourself a lot of work and headache if you can go ahead and make sure your products work before you buy that particular piece of equipment. So hydrogen peroxide and quats, as we know, are not sporicidal, so they're not going to kill C. difficile spores. Accelerated hydrogen peroxide does have a 1-minute norovirus kill claim. For C. difficile, we do need to use something that is a sporicidal agent. The most commonly used product, I think, in hospitals is some sort of chlorine solution, either one that is mixed or in a ready-to-use white format. There's a lot of products that are on the market now that are available, in a white format. Anytime you can get around to mixing bleach in your facility, you're better off because first of all, it's toxic, it can be an irritant, and then you always have to worry about that it's mixed appropriately. I received a call from a facility that a number of years ago that had an outbreak of C. difficile. So they had initiated cleaning their entire unit with bleach, and they were getting lots of complaints from the staff, coughing, respiratory irritant, patients were complaining. They were mixing up their bleach solution, so I just asked them what their mixture was, and they were actually using a 1 to 10, but they were using 10 parts bleach to 1 part water. So they thought in that particular case that if a little does good, a lot will do more. But that anytime you get away from mixing, especially disinfectants, you're going to be a lot better off. So then, in addition to our routine disinfection methods, we now know that there's a lot of very good no-touch technologies out there that are supplements to physical cleaning. They do not replace our regular routine cleaning, but they supplement it. UV technology has we definitely have evidence now to demonstrate that it can reduce the spread of infection. There have been lots of studies. The one you see on the second bullet point is a study that was funded by the CDC in an epicenter trial. And it was done in collaboration with community hospitals. 2 academic centers, Duke and UNC, participated. And I think the VA was part of that as well. And they, in that study, were able to demonstrate that there was a reduction in C. difficile infections of 11%. Now, the study used a lot of arms and used UV light in combination with clots and in combination with bleach, and then it used those different products by themselves as well. But there definitely is data to support the use of UV disinfection. Now, there are some facilities that use UV lighting in the OR, especially in your orthopedic OR rooms, because the orthopedic surgeons like it. I'm not aware of any data that demonstrates a reduction in surgical site infection if you do use UV lighting, but we do have that data for UV disinfection. There are a lot of types of devices on the market, and you see some of those named here on the slide. And certainly, as with everything, there's pros and cons to different types of units that you use. Certainly, cost is something that you definitely have to consider when evaluating these products. If you're using your UV equipment, and Jason is demonstrating, they do have these units at UNC, and you can see the unit in the picture here, the bedroom. You do need to open all the cabinets. It does need to touch the surface. As I mentioned earlier, the room should be disinfected or cleaned, terminally cleaned as it would if you were not using the UV technology, which poses a little bit of an operational issue because you have to strip the bed and clean it. Then the UV technology should be used prior to making the bed. So you just have to make sure that all those roles and responsibilities are clear and people will understand how all of that works out. So you do raise the bed rails again, so all those surfaces can be in contact with the UV light. And as I mentioned, leave the bed unmade. And they do one run, as you can see on the far side of the bed, over closest to the window. They position it there first. And then they reposition the light to the other side of the bed. They move the call bell, flip and move the telephone, so they have to move, again, they have to move all of those surfaces so the light can have contact with whatever environmental surface that you want to disinfect. So after they do the patient's room, then they take the unit into the restroom and run the device there. Now, as I mentioned, each one of these units are different. They have different times. They have different requirements as far as placement. Some have a sporicidal cycle, which increases the length of time that they need to be in the room. So if you are evaluating a product like this, they're very expensive, so you want to be sure you're going to get one that meets your needs and is the most user-friendly. It can cause some operational issues with your patient movement and patient flow. And then the other issue you need to think about is where you're going to use them. Are you going to use them just on isolation rooms when those patients are discharged? Are you going to use them in your operating room? Are you going to use them in areas like a playroom upon pediatrics? So you really need to decide and address how and where you're going to use those units. So then we're going to move on just a little bit to talking about the monitoring the effectiveness of cleaning. And you should have some system in place for monitoring the effectiveness of cleaning. Oftentimes we just use visual standard. If it looks clean, it is clean. And for our patients and visitors coming into the hospital, sometimes that works. You know, it looks clean, so they feel good about it. That's very important. But we know that you cannot always see the pathogens on surfaces, so you really do need to have some system for monitoring cleanliness in your facility. And what's very user-friendly and works really well is the use of fluorescent markers. And you can see here that Jason has detailed their process. They will mark some of the high-touch surfaces in a room after the person's gone home. Prior to the environmental service worker coming in to clean the room, those surfaces will be marked, and they can be marked. I mean, some facilities, the IP actually marks them. That usually only works if your facility is really small. Because you guys just don't have time to do that, and I certainly don't advocate that. I don't think that's your role. But they will do it. They'll mark some surfaces. The environmental service person will come in not knowing that what, if anything, has been marked, clean the room. You'll go back and use a flashlight to look for presence of the marker to determine if it's been completely removed, which indicates the surface is well cleaned, or if it was just smeared. And the surface was just touched. So that's a very efficient way to do that. As Judy mentioned this morning, some people are using ATP to do that, but that monitoring tool really only measures organic load and not microbial load or microbe load. So it's probably not your most reliable option for monitoring the effectiveness of cleaning. In one study that they looked at comparing, visual monitoring, fluorescent, ATP, and then culturing, they found that the fluorescent results were most mimicked the microbiological data. So the visual monitoring was kind of the lowest end on the spectrum, but then ATP was much less efficient than the fluorescent marking. Culturing is can be very expensive and resource intense if you don't have a lab dedicated to helping you with that. But fluorescent marking is fairly economical and easy to use and provides you with some really good results as well. And then once you've got your monitoring program in place, one of the most important things about that, there's a couple of important things. The first one I like to say is that immediate feedback to the person who cleaned the room is essential for educational purposes, and these should not be used for punitive reasons or disciplinary action or any of those sorts of things. It really should be educational. I mean, clearly if you have someone who continues not to do what they need to do, that's a different story. But on-the-spot training is really good. And then aggregate reporting at the Infection Prevention Committee is essential. You can use something like a heat map and identify the surface that was marked, and then at baseline, what it looked like, and then first quarter, second quarter, and use the red and green. Green's good, red's bad. And that's very powerful for the infection prevention community. It gives them a lot of information in a very consolidated way. And then it looks like UNC monitor individuals routinely, either weekly or monthly based on their schedule. And then they identify that to use to target what kind of education they need to provide for their staff. And then I think we have one more slide that I added that I thought might just give you an idea of something that other people are doing related to looking at cleaning. And this is a set of guidelines that are written by the Asia Pacific Society of Infection Control. And I think Dr. Weber, actually from UNC, has done some work with them. But they have guidelines, lots of infection control guidelines, but they have a set specific for environmental cleaning. And they actually had a little matrix in their guidelines that I thought was interesting, where you could do kind of a risk assessment of the type of area that you're going to be cleaning and look at the probability of contamination, the potential for exposure in that area, what kind of population you're servicing, and then you could score that and really share that with your EVS individuals about these are the areas that we really need to be in tune and make sure that we may need to clean more frequently. There is a lot more information now about it's not just that we clean, but how often do we do it? And the more we decontaminate, we know the lower burden of microbes are on those environmental surfaces. So I think I did good this time, Amy. So I'm right on time. But we we have time for some questions if there are any.
Evelyn, here's one. If you have an outside contractor cleaning your facility, should they be terminally cleaning your rooms, or can staff do that?
I'm not sure by staff if you mean nursing staff or dedicated, or if there's other staff dedicated within the facility that might do that. If you have a contracted environmental service department, I would think they would be doing your terminal cleaning. Nursing staff have a lot of responsibilities, and I don't think that they can. I'm not saying they can't do it, but you would need to ensure that they've been adequately trained and that their competencies for environmental cleaning were validated as well. So I think people that are trained in that role, whether they're contracted or employed by your hospital, are the most appropriate people to do that.
And Evelyn, we've got another question. We use the fluorescent marker in our facility. Our facilities director says that the wipes don't always clean off the marker, no matter how hard they clean. I've addressed this issue, but it doesn't seem to matter to him. Any idea how I can make him understand that the housekeepers aren't cleaning correctly?
Yeah, I don't know why people have to be difficult, right? But I've heard that before, and one of the first things I would do is kind of look at your marking solution to make sure that it is something that, and I would test it. I mean, you've probably already done that. But I'd actually get the marking solution and I would put it on a surface and I would take a wipe and I would just see myself. I would, try it out myself. Some solutions, if the product's old, or there may be a solution that it is more difficult to remove. I'm not sure of that. But I think the best way to convince him would be to try it yourself and say, well, I'd like for you just to watch me. And I'm going to clean this, and then we're going to look at it and see if we get the mark off. And if it comes off, I think he'd be hard pressed to say that it's the wipes fault rather than his staff. So that would be the approach I would use. And if it continues, then it might be something you would want to bring up at the committee, and just say this is the data. These are the marks that haven't been removed through regular cleaning.
Evelyn, we've got another one. We have recently had a rep pushing a new product called SteraMist. It uses a mist to break the bond of the spores. It says that it increases turnaround on rooms and is more cost effective than using the UV lighting. Have you heard a lot of research supporting this?
So I have heard of SteraMist. I'm not as familiar with that vendor name and that product. There have always been mist options for this enhanced cleaning. The problem with the mist, and I can't speak to the SteraMist because I'm not sure about what their agent is, but if you ask that question tomorrow, Dr. Ratala, I bet he is familiar with them. But the problem with mist, generally, you have to seal off the ventilation system. There usually are some other ventilation issues related to using the mist that you don't have with the UV lighting, the units that just use the UV lighting. So those are all issues that you need to look at and address. And again, I bet Dr. Ratala is familiar with that specific product. So you might want to ask him that question tomorrow. The only other thing I will say is that you cannot always believe everything a vendor tells you. And you guys that have been doing this for a little while probably know that. So just kind of keep that in mind. And but I'm sure Dr. Ratala can give you more information about that particular product.
Evelyn, we have another question. You said that there should be a policy about privacy curtains. Could you just clarify that? Someone lost sound for a little bit.
Okay, sure. You should just have a policy about how often they're going to be cleaned. And what that cleaning is going to look like. Are they actually going to be taken down and laundered? And your policy is probably going to say something like, when visibly soiled, after use on an contact isolation patient, not necessarily airborne, but contact in particular, and on some routine basis, and that might be every 3 months or every 6 months. And then again, you might want to look into the data that supports use of the spray, improved hydrogen peroxide to use intermittently or on daily cleaning of those curtains. But you should have some policy that directs your environmental service people as to how often those curtains should be changed.
All righty. Okay. All right, so I don't think we have any more chats or questions.
Okay.
While everybody is on the line, we will reconvene at 1:45 for the final webinar of the day. And but I do want to mention that I've been able to schedule the webinar for disaster planning for Friday at noon. So that link also appears on your webpage Friday at noon, and it will be recorded if you're unable to make that time. I also want to mention that I've spoken with the Friday Center representative, and they are expecting us back tomorrow at 8 a.m. So we will dispense with the webinars after this last one this afternoon and get back into our live presentation format. We're all excited to see your faces tomorrow. Um,
And if you guys can think of any questions, any other questions, obviously I'll be there tomorrow, and the tour should be interesting. I think you'll enjoy those. So.
okay. Well, we will end this session and meet back at 1:45 with Dr. Willis. We'll see you shortly. Thanks, Evelyn.
Thank you.